Yeah, Dad said that I could stay in San Pedro if I found somebody to board with that he approved of, and if I maintained a C average or better, and I took care of my own expenses. Well, and also he wanted me to come see him a couple of times during the last part of the year, and he would furnish the trains fare. And I was already had a job working afternoons in the grocery store, which for tips, and I kept. And I got a job setting pins in a bowling alley. Well, setting pins then was a little different from the way they do it today. Today it's all automatic. Then the only automatic thing was you had to bend over, pick them up, put them in this rack overhead, and then by hand lower the rack, release the pins, and bring it back up. So it was not easy, but it paid, I think we got paid 10 cents a line. That doesn't sound like much now, but then it was. Plus tips. And some of these guys, they get a little tipsy and, they'd throw a $50 down that's 5 hours work, guy, down the aisle and stuff like that. And we got to bowl for free. We'd set pins for each other, and that's when I learned how to bowl, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I did maintain a C average, actually better than that, but, and I would ride the train, the Starlight, up to see Granddad Inn in San Francisco, and sometimes the Daylight back home. There's 2 trains between Frisco and LA. And it was a good experience. Dad was a smart guy, and he knew how to teach a lesson. And I knew then that I didn't want to do that kind of stuff the rest of my life, for sure. And earlier he taught me a different lesson. When I was in Alexandria, Virginia, that was at Mount Vernon High School, he decided to put me on an allowance. $12 a month. I'm like, wow, man, I'm in heaven here. He says, but you got to buy all your own clothes. I didn't know. So what? I remember the first time I bought a suit, I was so proud of it, It was secondhand. But I mean, I learned then how to, budget my money and stuff like that. I've since forgotten that stuff. But, Dad would know how to teach a lesson, and I never had any trouble respecting him at all, I'll tell you that. I won't say we didn't have our arguments and stuff like that, but we, back to San Pedro, I did manage to graduate, went to the senior prom with a girl, and obviously I didn't have a car. So I went to a neighbor that my folks used to live near, right next door too. And he worked at a used car lot. And I told him what my problem was. He says, I'll get you a car. And the word is, you're gonna have to get your parents to approve it after the weekend. And I says, okay, fine. He lent me a 1950 yellow Studebaker convertible with a red upholstery. Man, we were in hot heaven. And so myself and Dwayne Delbert Hale was the guy's name that I was living with. We took our 2 dates to Ciro's restaurant in Hollywood. Very up door. And to make a long story short, we each had 2 Cokes, a total of 8 Cokes, because we couldn't buy anything else. And I think it cost us like $20 or something like that. Yeah, well, that was cheap today, but then it was big bucks. And while we were there, we saw Mitzi Gaynor and a couple other stars I can't remember, but Mitzi Gaynor I thought I loved. But, and we went back home, and then I took the car back into the guy's thing the next day, And I said, well, my dad came down and looked at the car, and he says, hey, you know, it needs a muffler, there's a weak spot in the top, and he says, he doesn't want me to buy it. So I got out of that one. And I didn't get the guy in trouble either, so. After graduation, we had an all-night dance. And the guys were sneaking booze in and buy Talus bottles, anything they could get away with. And after the all-night dance, my folks met me, and I went to San Francisco. So by now, the statute of limitations has passed, so I don't worry about San Pedro anymore. Matter of fact, I haven't been back. As I say, there was a graduation class of 356, I think it was, and most of those kids were first generation American. I mean, their parents came from Czechoslovakia and all over the place. I mean, it was a UN of schools. And the whole time I was there, I never saw a fight between a white guy and a black guy. I saw some hellacious fights between two black guys and stuff like that. But they avoided friction between the interracial groups or international groups. And interestingly enough, when San Pedro played another school, the male student body would go. When San Pedro played at home, none of the other school's student body would show up, which I think gives you an idea of what San Pedro was back then. I say in Look magazine and Life magazine, they had articles on San Pedro saying San Pedro port of sin. So I never saw one of the articles, I don't know, but if you could reach the top of the bar, you could do almost anything. I mean, you know, it was not a really law-abiding city. I don't know what it is now. I think some of the areas have upgraded because of the proximity to the coast. I know they built houses along the coast, which since fell into the ocean because of storms or whatnot. But we enjoyed our time there. And Dwayne Hale, who I boarded with, his dad was military, was overseas at the time, so his mother appreciated the extra money. He raised rabbits. We would kill rabbits and have them to eat. He and I would go on bike rides together on a weekend. He and I both applied for the Coast Guard Academy. I got rejected for the same reason I got rejected from West Point, was because I had asthma as a kid. But I was good enough for the military later, but that's a different story. And he made it, but I understand while he was up there, he had an accident. He was a great diver. He had an accident and did something to his leg and got relieved, and I haven't touched base with him since. So I started college at City College of San Francisco, which at that time was a 2-year college. I started out in engineering because Dad was an engineer, and I thought about changing back to pre-med, but after a year and a half of school, I dropped out and went into service. I was always good at math. I took geometry and algebra and all that sort of stuff. And I got into calculus in college, and I never got a good start on it. I was one of 6 people that passed the class, and I got a D, which I think is a reflection on the teacher. And I understand that a couple of years later they got rid of him, but I remember he wore the same tie every day. But I joined a fraternity there. I mean, we didn't have fraternity houses, we just had, you know, parties. And dated, and I went to church at the military chapel in at St. Pete, in City of San Francisco. And a lot of churches I went to throughout my career or life were military chapels, which means Episcopal, Lutheran, whatever the chaplain is, that's the way the service was run. And I assisted actually in a lot of chapels, assisted the chaplain, and doing odd things, whatever they wanted. And I remember for the City of San Francisco, he asked the chaplain assistant, the military chaplain assistant, "What'd you do with all the wine that was left in the chalice?" And he said, "Well, I dumped it down the sewer." He says, "Yeah, you smell like a sewer." I mean, there's a lot of interesting things that go on, but anyway, I enjoyed my time at City College of San Francisco. I worked there at a gas station. I worked at Macy's for a while, selling sporting goods, and that was interesting because they taught us how to, if somebody comes in for a canteen, you sell them a mess kit. Your sleeping bag, you try to sell them a pup tent, all this sort of stuff, the stuff they teach you. And that was very good because they gave us, I think, $1 for dinner, and I just worked, the evening shift, and I got to ride the cable car to work, and at the time it was no big deal, but I mean today it would be something. I enjoyed that. I say I've enjoyed every place I've ever lived, but there's a few places I wouldn't go back to. So, I think anybody can say that. Times go on, and times change, and people change. And, I dropped out of school. I wanted to get the GI Bill, and it was about to expire. And so I joined the Army. I took basic training at Fort Ord, California, which is no longer in existence. I won't say I enjoyed that. And because, if the infiltration course, they'd have you sit in the stands listening to lectures of what you're supposed to do and what's going to happen. And meanwhile, there's guys, this is in January, meanwhile, there's guys out there hosing, getting the ground all muddy. And it's part of the training. And after my first day of basic, I was assigned to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which was where I took my Flash Ranger training, which is for being a fort observer. And Flash Ranger, because you tell by the flashes where the bullets or shells are landing and where the enemy shells are coming from and stuff like that. And after receiving all that training, I was sent to Battlefield Surveillance Department, Fort Huachuca, Arizona.
Good tight.
Yeah. And some of the work we did there was supposed to be classified, so I don't want to tell about all of it, but generally what we were doing is designing observation ways to observe the enemy and get information and stuff like that, including stuff at night. And our little experimental group, we were assigned to go on maneuvers. We went to Fort Bragg, where we were integrated into a airborne unit and for support and stuff like that. And then we went to Camp Polk, Louisiana, where we took part in maneuvers. And after that, we went back to Fort Huachuca. And we go to Mexico a lot. And we go to this one place and buy a case of beer. There was 25 bottles of cerveza to a case. And it cost like $1. Okay, maybe $1.25, I don't remember. And then we'd go to the area where they had all the saloons and entertainment. And we'd open a bottle of beer and we'd walk in with it. People carry beer from one place to the next. So when we get near finish, we walk out, go by the car, get another beer. well, it costs a quarter a beer in the casino or cantinas. And we managed to get out of there without any of us getting in trouble, but guys would get arrested, put in Mexican jails, and somebody'd have to bail them out. And fortunately, that never happened to me or any of my immediate friends. But one time I was there, I did get a late attack of asthma, because evidently the place where we were in shooting pool or something was very dusty, and I started having some real problems. And so this friend of mine, Enrique Fernando, his last name. Anyway, but he took me to the border, and the Border Patrol guys got an ambulance down from Fort Huachuca. They took me there, and I evidently recovered, and then they decided that, okay, what they should probably do with me is send me to the hospital, Letterman Army Hospital in San Francisco on the Presidio for testing and see what they could do with me, which they did. And I was in the ward, and my dad comes in full uniform, which is kind of embarrassing for a private. And they did all kinds of tests for me, and eventually gave me a medical discharge, which has ended my great career with the military. So, but I mean, I had my GI Bill.
You back to the one-handed push-ups and basic training?
Yeah, they did do things like that.
I thought you broke an arm or something. And
Oh, I did. I broke an arm. And
another arm.
Yeah, another arm. And I got a cast on my arm. That was my right arm, so I saluted with my left hand. And when you mess up, you have to drop down and get so many push-ups. And so, I messed up. And the guy says, okay, Masters, drop down and give me 10. And so I got down there and says, just a minute, Sergeant. I said, you're supposed to do them with me. And he says, okay. He gets down there with 2 hands. I said, So I only have 1 hand. And by that time, I'd learned how to do one-handed push-ups. And I did 10 of them. He never bugged me again. Well, I mean, I wasn't disrespectful.
Yeah.
And you can not really sass a person, but you can talk to somebody, without being disrespectful. And I learned how to do that. Maybe that gift came to me from my brother, I don't know. He was so good at telling stories, even back then, if something would come up. So anyway, yeah, and so I got out of the Army. I then joined my folks, who by then were in Maryland at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, right? And I went to school at the University of Maryland. In the summer, I got a job driving a truck, a moving van, and then went back to school again. I really didn't like University of Maryland because there was too many students there, and I didn't live on campus. I boarded in a room in a house, and so then I moved to. Then and Dad were talking about retiring, and they were talking about retiring in Atlanta. So I said, okay, I'll go down to Atlanta, maybe I'll go to Emory. And I went down to Atlanta, but instead I went to Georgia State College, which was inexpensive, although I did have to pay out-of-state tuition. At that time, I had to pay $150 a quarter, which is cheap, really. And even after I was there for a year, I didn't get my tuition reduced until I think my last year there. But I decided to go back to pre-med, and I worked. I had several jobs. I worked in the theater. That was a con job. I got these books on lights, different kind of theatrical lights, and I studied them. And I went in to get this job. And I says, oh, you have a such and such, a such and such and such, you got a stormtrooper? Oh, no, we can't afford that. I said, man, they're supposed to be really good. And we talked, and he said, by the way, when can you start? And I said, well, I can start anytime you want me. He says, oh, tomorrow? I says, fine. I'll see you whatever time. And then the next day, I was doing something, hooking up some lights. I mean, I had wired wires together in the military, because you all learned how to do that. And he looked at me, he says, where did you learn how to do that? And I said, well, we probably need to have a conversation. And I told him, I says, I've never done this before. And he says, you told me? And I told him exactly what I'd done. He said, you know what? If you can do that, I can teach you. And so I had my job.
Huh.
And then later on, I got a job managing a moose club, Loyal Order of Moose. In Atlanta, you could not serve mixed drinks unless you were a private club. And I was managing this private club, and they had gambling machines in it, and I was making pretty good money, and I was very happy with it. Until one day we got a call from the lieutenant on the vice squad that was a member of the club saying, hey, you're going to get raided. We said, well, we'll have all the machines out in the morning. He said, no, they're coming. So I ran down the street, rented a truck, drove it to the back door, backed up. Customers and the bartender were all putting these machines in the back of the truck. I closed it up, locked it, and started going out the back alley.
Uh-oh.
And here comes a cop car with its light on, but no siren. And he turned in right in front of me. And I leaned my hand out the window. I said, sir, if you're in a hurry, it's quicker if you back up. And he backed up, and I drove off. And I thought, whoa. And so then I told the board, I said, hey, I've had it with this. This is a week for you to decide. You either give me, I forget, $150 a week more than I was getting or something like that, or you have 2 weeks' notice. And they offered me $100 a week extra. And at that time I decided, the risk here is of going to jail. And I'm not ready to do that. And I'm ready to go back to school. So I told them, I said, I'm sorry guys, I'm just gonna go back to school. And so I did. But I mean, while I was working at the club, I'd have an 8 o'clock class. I'd get out of class, I'd run to the club, I'd give the bartender his bag, I'm supposed to go on duty at 10. And then I'd run back to school for another class, and then I'd come back, and it was a hassle, so, but I mean, the money was good, I had no problem, that's where I met Joyce. She came with a friend one time, and of course, Joyce and I ended up getting married, but we dated. At first she wouldn't date me, and then I finally conned her into it. And then, let's see, then I decided to pick a job at school. I worked in the library, which saved a lot of money because I didn't have to buy books then. I got the books I needed in the library, and I hid them, and I used them, and I studied in the stacks. I was a little criminal, And I finally got out of school, and I applied for a job at Communicable Disease Center, and because my emphasis was on microbiology. And after an interview, I was told I had to take the FSEE exam, which is the Federal Service Entry Exam. And they said, this is a technicality. I mean, they were all ready to hire me. And I said, but I had to pass this technicality. So I went down, I took the exam. I got a fantastic grade on it because of my 10-point disability. So I was on the top of the list, and I was a disabled vet. So, ding ding, I got a call from a guy named John, forget his last name. He was the director of the Atlanta division of FDA. At that time, FDA also had the responsibility for illegal sale of drugs. And so, you know, he interviewed, I told him, well, I said, already have a job lined up with CDC. He said, well, why don't you come down for an interview, maybe you'll learn something. And I said, okay, I'm always game for that. He said, but I work during the week. I said, how about, can you talk to me on Saturday? He said, sure. So I met him on a Saturday at their office, the post office building, and he was a good salesman. He says, do you really want to look at four walls every day, or do you want to get out and do things? I said, you know what, I want to get out and do things. He says, well, you can come to work for me. I said, well, April 1st is when I was supposed to report at CDC. He says, well, we can't quite do that, but Monday, April 4th is the start of a pay period. Will you go for that? And I says, yeah, we'll do that. And they hadn't even done the background on me yet. And so they were doing the background on me while I was working for them. And I didn't realize that until a neighbor told me, hey, you know, the FBI was checking up on you. What have you been doing lately? And so I went to work, and I became an investigator. And after I got out of training, and they found that I had driven a moving van, they decided, hey, here's a good chance. You can go undercover and drive a tractor trailer and do all kinds of good things for us. And I did that. I did that until 1960. I was still doing it in
Knoxville.
Knoxville. And until I became a supervisor in Cincinnati, which was
66.
66. So anyway, I did that in Atlanta. We covered 4 states, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. And then I blessed the first manufacturer, illegal manufacturer, making pills. And that was a first. And
What kind of pills?
but he was doing amphetamines and barbiturates. And that was the first time we busted a manufacturer. And we had to prove interstate commerce on that at that point in time. And we proved interstate commerce by doing ballistics. And we had a guy that would examine pills, and he could tell what punch made what pills, as long as he had the punch on record. And he had punches from all the legitimate manufacturers. So if it didn't match one of that, he'd know. So, of course, when we raided this guy's house, he had to set up in his house. We sent him punches, and he was able to match them. And I went to jail. So I had a few guys go to jail. I remember one guy, what was his name? I forget it. I can't think of his name right now. But he would sell me large quantities. And the night that I closed on the house, when we bought the house in Knoxville, that night I had to meet him at the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. And I made arrangements then for him to bring me a big load of drugs to Knoxville, and I told where I'd meet him. And then I got back home the next day in time to take a shower before we went to close on the house. And I was thinking, boy, you know, those guys could have taken me for a ride, and I wouldn't, totally unaware of it. But that turned out to be my biggest bust when he came in with that stuff. He lost his car, got 8 years in jail. And what worried me is, I got pictures of it, what worried me is, he told me once he'd rather kill somebody than go back to jail, which means he was a felon. Mm-hmm. And convicted felons not allowed to have a weapon. And so when I met him that time at the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, he showed me his pistol. I think he was trying to, you know, see how I'd react. I said, hey, that's neat. And I looked at it, you know, that's pretty good. He had it long to you know, talked about it, and gave it back to him. And then when we were part of the company, he drove across the state line.
Mm.
So I had him for carrying a weapon across state lines.